Welcome, dear listener, to this evening's audiobook. This reading is brought to you by Sleepy Sounds. Tonight, we will be reading The Marsh King's Daughter, as written by Hans Christian Andersen. So, as the gentle sound of the soft rain starts to fall, let us begin our journey together. The Marsh King's Daughter. The storks relate to their little ones a great many stories, and they are all about moors and reed banks, and suited to their age and capacity. The youngest of them are quite satisfied with cribble, crabble, or such nonsense, and think it very grand. But the elder ones want something with a deeper meaning, or at least something about their own family. We are only acquainted with one of the two longest and oldest stories which the storks relate. It is about Moses, who was exposed by his mother on the banks of the Nile, and was found by the king's daughter, who gave him a good education, and he afterwards became a great man. But where he was buried is still unknown. Everyone knows this story, but not the second. Very likely because it is quite an inland story. It has been repeated from mouth to mouth, from one stork mama to another, for thousands of years, and each has told it better than the last. And now we mean to tell it better than all. The first stork pair who related it lived at the time it happened, and had their summer residence on the rafters of the Viking's house, which stood near the wild moorlands of Wensissel. That is, to speak more correctly, the great Moorheath, high up in the north of Jutland, by the Skjagen Peak. This wilderness is still an immense wild heath of marshy ground, about which we can read in the official directory. It is said that in olden times the place was a lake, the ground of which had heaved up from beneath, and now the moorland extends for miles in every direction and is surrounded by damp meadows, trembling, undulating swamps, and marshy ground covered with turf, on which grow bilberry bushes and stunted trees. Mists are almost always hovering over this region, which, 70 years ago, was overrun with wolves. It may well be called the Wild Moor, and one can easily imagine, with such a wild expanse of marsh and lake, how lonely and dreary it must have been 1,000 years ago. Many things may be noticed now that existed then. The reeds grow to the same height and bear the same kind of long, purple-brown leaves with their feathery tips. There still stands the birch, with its white bark and its delicate, loosely hanging leaves. And with regard to the living beings who frequented this spot, the fly still wears a gauzy dress of the same cut, and the favorite colors of the stork are white, with black and red for stockings. The people, certainly in those days, wore very different dresses to those they now wear. But if any of them, be he huntsman or squire, master or servant, ventured on the wavering, undulating, marshy ground of the moor, they met with the same fate 1,000 years ago as they would now. The wanderer sank and went down to the Marsh King, as he is named, who rules in the great moorland empire beneath. They also called him Gunkel King, but we like the name of Marsh King better, and we will give him that name as the storks do. Very little is known of the Marsh King's rule, but that perhaps is a good thing. In the neighborhood of the moorlands, and not far from the great arm of the North Sea, and the Kattegat, which is called the Lumfjorden, lay the castle of the Viking, with its watertight stone cellars, its tower, and its 3 projecting stories. On the ridge of the roof, the stork had built his nest, and there the stork mama sat on her eggs and felt sure her hatching would come to something. One evening, Stork Papa stayed out rather late, and when he came home, he seemed quite busy, bustling, and important. "I have something very dreadful to tell you," said he to the stork mamma. "Keep it to yourself then," she replied. "Remember that I am hatching eggs. It may agitate me. It will affect them." "You must know it at once," said he. "The daughter of our host in Egypt has arrived here. She has ventured to take this journey, and now she is lost." "She who sprung from the race of the fairies, is it?" cried the mother stork. "Oh, tell me all about it. You know I cannot bear to be kept waiting at a time when I am hatching eggs." "Well, you see, mother," he replied, "she believed what the doctor said, and what I have heard you state also, that the moor flowers which grow about here would heal her sick father. And she has flown to the north in swan's plumage, in company with some other swan princesses, who come to these parts every year to renew their youth. She came, and where is she now?" "You enter into particulars too much," said the mamma stork, "and the eggs may take cold. I cannot bear such suspense as this." "Well," said he, "I have kept watch, and this evening I went among the rushes, where I thought the marshy ground would bear me. And while I was there, 3 swans came. Something in their manner of flying seemed to say to me, 'Look carefully now. There is one not all swan, only swan's feathers.' You know, mother, you have the same intuitive feeling that I have. You know whether a thing is right or not immediately." "Yes, of course," said she. "But tell me about the princess. I am tired of hearing about the swan's feathers." "Well, you know that in the middle of the moor there is something like a lake," said the stork papa. "You can see the edge of it if you raise yourself a little. Just there, by the reeds and the green banks, lay the trunk of an elder tree. Upon this, the 3 swans stood flapping their wings and looking about them. One of them threw off her plumage, and I immediately recognized her as one of the princesses of our home in Egypt. There she sat, without any covering but her long black hair. I heard her tell the 2 others to take great care of the swan's plumage, while she dipped down into the water to pluck the flowers which she fancied she saw there. The others nodded and picked up the feather dress and took possession of it. I wonder what will become of it, thought I, and she most likely asked herself the same question. If so, she received an answer, a very practical one, for the 2 swans rose up and flew away with their swan's plumage. "Dive down now," they said. "Thou shalt never more fly in the swan's plumage. Thou shalt never again see Egypt. Here, on the moor, thou wilt remain." So saying, they tore the swan's plumage into 1,000 pieces. The feathers drifted about like a snow shower, and then the 2 deceitful princesses flew away. "Why, that is terrible," said the stork mamma. "I feel as if I could hardly bear to hear any more. But you must tell me what happened next." The princess wept and lamented aloud. Her tears moistened the elder stump, which was really not an elder stump, but the Marsh King himself, he who in marshy ground lives and rules. I saw myself how the stump of the tree turned round, and was a tree no more, while long, clammy branches like arms were extended from it. Then the poor child was terribly frightened, and started up to run away. She hastened to cross the green, slimy ground, but it will not bear any weight, much less hers. She quickly sank, and the elder stump dived immediately after her. In fact, it was he who drew her down. Great black bubbles rose up out of the moor slime, and with these every trace of the 2 vanished. And now the princess is buried in the wild marsh, She will never now carry flowers to Egypt to cure her father. It would have broken your heart, mother, had you seen it. You ought not to have told me, said she, at such a time as this. The eggs might suffer. But I think the princess will soon find help. Someone will rise up to help her. Ah, if it had been you or I, or one of our people, it would have been all over with us. I mean to go every day, said he, to see if anything comes to pass. And so he did. A long time went by, but at last he saw a green stalk shooting up out of the deep, marshy ground. As it reached the surface of the marsh, a leaf spread out and unfolded itself broader and broader, and close to it came forth a bud. One morning, when the stork papa was flying over the stem, he saw that the power of the sun's rays had caused the bud to open, and in the cup of the flower lay a charming child, a little maiden, looking as if she had just come out of a bath. The little one was so like the Egyptian princess that the stork, at the first moment, thought it must be the princess herself. But after a little reflection, he decided that it was much more likely to be the daughter of the princess and the Marsh king. And this explained also her being placed in the cup of a water lily. But she cannot be left to lie here, thought the stork, and in my nest there are already so many. But stay, I have thought of something. The wife of the Viking has no children, and how often she has wished for a little one. People always say the stork brings the little ones. I will do so in earnest this time. I shall fly with the child to the Viking's wife. What rejoicing there will be. And then the stork lifted the little girl out of the flower cup, flew to the castle, picked a hole with his beak in the bladder-covered window, and laid the beautiful child in the bosom of the Viking's wife. Then he flew back quickly to the stork mama and told her what he had seen and done. And the little storks listened to it all, for they were then quite old enough to do so. So you see, he continued, that the princess is not dead, for she must have sent her little one up here. And now I have found a home for her. Ah, I said it would be so from the first, replied the stork mama. But now think a little of your own family. Our traveling time draws near, and I sometimes feel a little irritation already under the wings. The cuckoos and the nightingale are already gone, and I heard the quails say they should go too as soon as the wind was favorable. Our youngsters will go through all the maneuvers at the review very well, or I am much mistaken in them. The Viking's wife was above measure delighted when she awoke the next morning and found the beautiful little child lying in her bosom. She kissed it and caressed it, but it cried terribly and struck out with its arms and legs and did not seem to be pleased at all. At last it cried itself to sleep, and as it lay there so still and quiet, it was a most beautiful sight to see. The Viking's wife was so delighted that body and soul were full of joy. Her heart felt so light within her that it seemed as if her husband and his soldiers, who were absent, must come home as suddenly and unexpectedly as the little child had done. She and her whole household therefore busied themselves in preparing everything for the reception of her lord. The long, colored tapestry, on which she and her maidens had worked pictures of their idols, Odin, Thor, and Frigga, was hung up. The slaves polished the old shields that served as ornaments. Cushions were placed on the seats, and dry wood laid on the fireplaces in the center of the hall, so that the flames might be fanned up at a moment's notice. The Viking's wife herself assisted in the work, so that at night she felt very tired and quickly fell into a sound sleep. When she awoke, just before morning, she was terribly alarmed to find that the infant had vanished. She sprang from her couch, lighted a pine chip, and searched all round the room, when, at last, in that part of the bed where her feet had been, lay, not the child, but a great, ugly frog. She was quite disgusted at this sight, and seized a heavy stick to kill the frog. But the creature looked at her with such strange, mournful eyes that she was unable to strike the blow. Once more she searched round the room. Then she started at hearing the frog utter a low, painful croak. She sprang from the couch and opened the window hastily. At the same moment, the sun rose, and threw its beams through the window, till it rested on the couch where the great frog lay. Suddenly, it appeared as if the frog's broad mouth contracted and became small and red. The limbs moved and stretched out and extended themselves till they took a beautiful shape. And behold, there was the pretty child lying before her, and the ugly frog was gone. "How is this?" she said. "Have I had a wicked dream? Is it not my own lovely cherub that lies there?" Then she kissed it and fondled it, but the child struggled and fought and bit as if she had been a little wild cat. The Viking did not return on that day, nor the next. He was, however, on the way home. But the wind, so favorable to the storks, was against him, for it blew towards the south. A wind in favor of one is often against another. After 2 or 3 days had passed, it became clear to the Viking's wife how matters stood with the child. It was under the influence of a powerful sorcerer. By day, it was charming in appearance as an angel of light, but with a temper wicked and wild, while at night, in the form of an ugly frog, it was quiet and mournful, with eyes full of sorrow. Here were 2 natures, changing inwardly and outwardly with the absence and return of sunlight. And so it happened that by day the child, with the actual form of its mother, possessed the fierce disposition of its father. At night, on the contrary, its outward appearance plainly showed its descent on the father's side, while inwardly it had the heart and mind of its mother. Who would be able to loosen this wicked charm which the sorcerer had worked upon it? The wife of the Viking lived in constant pain and sorrow about it. Her heart clung to the little creature, but she could not explain to her husband the circumstances in which it was placed. He was expected to return shortly, and were she to tell him, he would very likely, as was the custom at that time, expose the poor child in the public highway, and let anyone take it away who would. The good wife of the Viking could not let that happen, and she therefore resolved that the Viking should never see the child excepting by daylight. One morning, there sounded a rushing of storks' wings over the roof. More than 100 pair of storks had rested there during the night to recover themselves after their excursion, and now they soared aloft and prepared for the journey southward. "All the husbands are here and ready," they said, "wives and children also." "How light we are," cried the young storks in chorus. "Something pleasant seems creeping over us, even down to our toes, as if we were full of live frogs. Ah, how delightful it is to travel into foreign lands. Hold yourselves properly in the line with us," cried Papa and Mama. "Do not use your beak so much. It tries the lungs." And then the storks flew away. About the same time sounded the clang of the warriors' trumpets across the heath. The Viking had landed with his men returning home, richly laden with spoil from the Gallic coast, where the people, as did also the inhabitants of Britain, often cried in alarm, "Deliver us from the wild Northmen." Life and noisy pleasure came with them into the castle of the Viking on the moorland. A great cask of mead was drawn into the hall. Piles of wood blazed. Cattle were slain and served up, that they might feast in reality. The priest who offered the sacrifice sprinkled the devoted parishioners with the warm blood. The fire crackled, and the smoke rolled along beneath the roof. The soot fell upon them from the beams, but they were used to all these things. Guests were invited and received handsome presents. All wrongs and unfaithfulness were forgotten. They drank deeply and threw in each other's faces the bones that were left, which was looked upon as a sign of good feeling amongst them. A bard, who was a kind of musician as well as warrior, and who had been with the Viking in his expedition and knew what to sing about, gave them one of his best songs, in which they heard all their warlike deeds praised, and every wonderful action brought forward with honor. Every verse ended with this refrain: "Gold and possessions will flee away. Friends and foes must die one day. Every man on earth must die, but a famous name will never die." And with that, they beat upon their shields and hammered upon the table with knives and bones in a most outrageous manner. The Viking's wife sat upon a raised cross seat in the open hall. She wore a silk dress, golden bracelets, and large amber beads. She was in costly attire, and the bard named her in his song, and spoke of the rich treasure of gold which she had brought to her husband. Her husband had already seen the wonderfully beautiful child in the daytime, and was delighted with her beauty. Even her wild ways pleased him. He said the little maiden would grow up to be a heroine, with the strong will and determination of a man. She would never wink her eyes, even if, in joke, an expert hand should attempt to cut off her eyebrows with a sharp sword. The full cask of mead soon became empty, and a fresh one was brought in, for these were people who liked plenty to eat and drink. The old proverb, which everyone knows, says that the cattle know when to leave their pasture, but a foolish man knows not the measure of his own appetite. Yes, they all knew this, but men may know what is right, and yet often do wrong. They also knew that even the welcome guest becomes wearisome when he sits too long in the house. But there they remained, for pork and mead are good things. And so at the Viking's house they stayed and enjoyed themselves. And at night, the bondmen slept in the ashes and dipped their fingers in the fat and licked them. Oh, it was a delightful time. Once more, in the same year, the Viking went forth, though the storms of autumn had already commenced to roar. He went with his warriors to the coast of Britain. He said that it was but an excursion of pleasure across the water. So his wife remained at home with the little girl. After a while, it is quite certain the foster mother began to love the poor frog, with its gentle eyes and its deep sighs, even better than the little beauty who bit and fought with all around her. The heavy, damp mists of autumn, which destroy the leaves of the wood, had already fallen upon forest and heath. Feathers of plucked birds, as they call the snow, flew about in thick showers, and winter was coming. The sparrows took possession of the stork's nest, and conversed about the absent owners in their own fashion. And they, the stork pair, and all their young ones, where were they staying now? The storks might have been found in the land of Egypt where the sun's rays shone forth bright and warm, as it does here at midsummer. Tamarines and acacias were in full bloom all over the country. The crescent of Mahomet glittered brightly from the cupolas of the mosques, and on the slender pinnacles sat many of the storks, resting after their long journey. Swarms of them took divided possession of the nests which lay close to each other between the venerable columns, and crowded the arches of temples in forgotten cities. The date and the palm lifted themselves as a screen or as a sunshade over them. The gray pyramids looked like broken shadows in the clear air in the far-off desert, where the ostrich wheels his rapid flight, and the lion, with his subtle eyes, gazes at the marble sphinx which lies half buried in sand. The waters of the Nile had retreated, and the whole bed of the river was covered with frogs, which was a most acceptable prospect for the stork families. The young storks thought their eyes deceived them. Everything around appeared so beautiful. "It is always like this here, and this is how we live in our warm country," said the stork mama. And the thought made the young ones almost beside themselves with pleasure. "Is there anything more to see?" they asked. "Are we going farther into the country?" "There is nothing further for us to see," answered the stork mama. "Beyond this delightful region, there are immense forests, where the branches of the trees entwine round each other, while prickly, creeping plants cover the paths, and only an elephant could force a passage for himself with his great feet. The snakes are too large, and the lizards too lively for us to catch. Then there is the desert. If you went there, your eyes would soon be full of sand with the lightest breeze, and if it should blow great guns, you would most likely find yourself in a sand drift. Here is the best place for you, where there are frogs and locusts. Here I shall remain, and so must you." And so they stayed. The parents sat in the nest on the slender minaret and rested, yet still were busily employed in cleaning and smoothing their feathers, and in sharpening their beaks against their red stockings. Then they would stretch out their necks, salute each other, and gravely raise their heads with the high polished forehead and soft, smooth feathers, while their brown eyes shone with intelligence. The female young ones strutted about amid the moist rushes, glancing at the other young storks and making acquaintances, and swallowing a frog at every third step, or tossing a little snake about with their beaks, in a way they considered very becoming. And besides, it tasted very good. The young male storks soon began to quarrel. They struck at each other with their wings and pecked with their beaks till the blood came. And in this manner, many of the young ladies and gentlemen were betrothed to each other. It was, of course, what they wanted, and indeed what they lived for. Then they returned to a nest, and there the quarreling began afresh. For in hot countries, people are almost all violent and passionate. But for all that, it was pleasant, especially for the old people, who watched them with great joy. All that their young ones did suited them. Every day here there was sunshine, plenty to eat, and nothing to think of but pleasure. But in the rich castle of their Egyptian host, as they called him, pleasure was not to be found. The rich and mighty lord of the castle lay on his couch in the midst of the great hall, with its many colored walls looking like the center of a great tulip. But he was stiff and powerless in all his limbs, and lay stretched out like a mummy. His family and servants stood round him. He was not dead, although he could scarcely be said to live. The healing moorflower from the north, which was to have been found and brought to him by her who loved him so well, had not arrived. His young and beautiful daughter, who, in swan's plumage, had flown over land and seas to the distant north, had never returned. She is dead, so the two swan maidens had said when they came home, and they made up quite a story about her, and this is what they told. We three flew away together through the air, said they. A hunter caught sight of us and shot at us with an arrow. The arrow struck our young friend and sister, and slowly singing her farewell song, she sank down, a dying swan, into the forest lake. On the shores of the lake, under a spreading birch tree, we laid her in the cold earth. We had our revenge. We bound fire under the wings of a swallow, who had a nest on the thatched roof of the huntsman. The house took fire and burst into flames. The hunter was burnt with the house, and the light was reflected over the sea as far as the spreading birch, beneath which we laid her sleeping dust. She will never return to the land of Egypt. And then they both wept. And Stork Papa, who heard the story, snapped with his beak so that it might be heard a long way off. Deceit and lies, said he. I should like to run my beak deep into their chests. And perhaps break it off, said the mamma stork. Then what a sight you would be. Think first of yourself, and then of your family. All others are nothing to us. Yes, I know, said the stork papa. But tomorrow I can easily place myself on the edge of the open cupola when the learned and wise men assemble to consult on the state of the sick man. Perhaps they may come a little nearer to the truth. And the learned and wise men assembled together and talked a great deal on every point. But the stork could make no sense out of anything they said. Neither were there any good results from their consultations, either for the sick man or for his daughter in the marshy heath. When we listen to what people say in this world, we shall hear a great deal. But it is an advantage to know what has been said and done before when we listen to a conversation. The stork did, and we know at least as much as he, the stork. Love is a life giver. The highest love produces the highest life. Only through love can the sick man be cured. This had been said by many, and even the learned men acknowledged that it was a wise saying. What a beautiful thought, exclaimed the papa stork immediately. I don't quite understand it, said the mamma stork, when her husband repeated it. However, it is not my fault, but the fault of the thought. Whatever it may be, I have something else to think of. Now, the learned men had spoken also of love between this one and that one, of the difference of the love which we have for our neighbor, to the love that exists between parents and children, of the love of the plant for the light, and how the germ springs forth when the sunbeam kisses the ground. All these things were so elaborately and learnedly explained that it was impossible for Stork Papa to follow it, much less to talk about it. His thoughts on the subject quite weighed him down. He stood the whole of the following day on one leg, with half-shut eyes, thinking deeply. So much learning was quite a heavy weight for him to carry. One thing, however, the papa stork could understand. Everyone, high and low, had from their inmost hearts expressed their opinion that it was a great misfortune for so many thousands of people, the whole country indeed, to have this man so sick, with no hopes of his recovery. And what joy and blessing it would spread around if he could by any means be cured. But where bloomed the flower that could bring him health? They had searched for it everywhere, in learned writings, in the shining stars, in the weather and wind. Inquiries had been made in every byway that could be thought of, until at last the wise and learned men has asserted, as we have been already told, that love, the life-giver, could alone give new life to a father. And in saying this, they had overdone it, and said more than they understood themselves. They repeated it, and wrote it down as a recipe. Love is a life-giver. But how could such a recipe be prepared? That was a difficulty they could not overcome. At last, it was decided that help could only come from the princess herself, whose whole soul was wrapped up in her father, especially as a plan had been adopted by her to enable her to obtain a remedy. More than a year had passed since the princess had set out at night, when the light of the young moon was soon lost beneath the horizon. She had gone to the marble sphinx in the desert, shaking the sand from her sandals, and then passed through the long passage, which leads to the center of one of the great pyramids, where the mighty kings of antiquity, surrounded with pomp and splendor, lie veiled in the form of mummies. She had been told by the wise men that if she laid her head on the breast of one of them, from the head she would learn where to find life and recovery for her father. She had performed all this, and in a dream had learnt that she must bring home to her father the lotus flower, which grows in the deep sea, near the moors and heath in the Danish land. The very place and situation had been pointed out to her, and she was told that the flower would restore her father to health and strength. And therefore she had gone forth from the land of Egypt, flying over to the open marsh and the wild moor in the plumage of a swan. The papa and mama storks knew all this, and we also know it now. We know, too, that the Marsh King has drawn her down to himself, and that to the loved ones at home she is forever dead. One of the wisest of them said, as the stork mama also said, that in some way she would, after all, manage to succeed. And so at last they comforted themselves with this hope and would wait patiently. In fact, they could do nothing better. I should like to get away the swan's feathers from those two treacherous princesses, said the papa stork. Then, at least, they would not be able to fly over again to the wild moor and do more wickedness. I can hide the two suits of feathers over yonder till we find some use for them. But where will you put them? Asked the mama stork. In our nest on the moor. I and the young ones will carry them by turns during our flight across. And as we return, should they prove too heavy for us, we shall be sure to find plenty of places on the way in which we can conceal them till our next journey. Certainly, one suit of swan's feathers would be enough for the princess, but two are always better. In those northern countries, no one can have too many traveling wrappers. No one will thank you for it, said Stork Mama, but you are master, and, excepting at breeding time, I have nothing to say. In the Viking's castle, on the wild moor, to which the storks directed their flight in the following spring, the little maiden still remained. They had named her Helga, which was rather too soft a name for a child with a temper like hers, although her form was still beautiful. Every month this temper showed itself in sharper outlines, and in the course of years, while the storks still made the same journeys in autumn to the hill, and in spring to the moors. The child grew to be almost a woman, and before anyone seemed aware of it, she was a wonderfully beautiful maiden of 16. The casket was splendid, but the contents were worthless. She was, indeed, wild and savage, even in those hard, uncultivated times. It was a pleasure to her to splash about with her white hands in the warm blood of the horse which had been slain for sacrifice. In one of her wild moods, she bit off the head of the black cock, which the priest was about to slay for the sacrifice. To her foster father, she said one day, "If thine enemy were to pull down thine house about thy ears, and thou shouldest be sleeping in unconscious security, I would not wake thee. Even if I had the power, I would never do it, for my ears still tingle with the blow that thou gavest me years ago. I have never forgotten it." But the Viking treated her words as a joke. He was, like everyone else, bewitched with her beauty, and knew nothing of the change in the form and temper of Helga at night. Without a saddle, she would sit on a horse as if she were a part of it, while it rushed along at full speed. Nor would she spring from its back, even when it quarreled with other horses and bit them. She would often leap from the high shore into the sea with all her clothes on, and swim to meet the Viking when his boat was steering home towards the shore. She once cut off a long lock of her beautiful hair and twisted it into a string for her bow. "If a thing is to be done well," said she, "I must do it myself." The Viking's wife was, for the time in which she lived, a woman of strong character and will. But compared to her daughter, she was a gentle, timid woman, and she knew that a wicked sorcerer had the terrible child in his power. It was sometimes as if Helga acted from sheer wickedness, for often when her mother stood on the threshold of the door or stepped into the yard, she would seat herself on the brink of the well, wave her arms and legs in the air, and suddenly fall right in. Here she was able, from her frog nature, to dip and dive about in the water of the deep well, until at last she would climb forth like a cat and come back into the hall, dripping with water, so that the green leaves that were strewed on the floor were whirled round and carried away by the streams that flowed from her. But there was one time of the day which placed a check upon Helga. It was the evening twilight. When this hour arrived, she became quiet and thoughtful, and allowed herself to be advised and led. Then also, a secret feeling seemed to draw her towards her mother. And as usual, when the sun set and the transformation took place, both in body and mind, inwards and outwards, she would remain quiet and mournful, with her form shrunk together in the shape of a frog. Her body was much larger than those animals ever are, and on this account it was much more hideous in appearance, for she looked like a wretched dwarf with a frog's head and webbed fingers. Her eyes had a most piteous expression. She was without a voice, excepting a hollow, croaking sound, like the smothered sobs of a dreaming child. Then the Viking's wife took her on her lap and forgot the ugly form as she looked into the mournful eyes, and often said, "I could wish that thou wouldst always remain my dumb frog child, for thou art too terrible when thou art clothed in a form of beauty." And the Viking woman wrote runic characters against sorcery and spells of sickness, and threw them over the wretched child. But they did no good. One can scarcely believe that she was ever small enough to lie in the cup of the water lily, said the Papa Stork. And now she is grown up, and the image of her Egyptian mother, especially about the eyes. Ah, we shall never see her again. Perhaps she has not discovered how to help herself, as you and the wise men said she would. Year after year have I flown across and across the moor, but there was no sign of her being still alive. Yes, and I may as well tell you that each year, when I arrived a few days before you to repair the nest and put everything in its place, I have spent a whole night flying here and there over the marshy lake, as if I had been an owl or a bat, but all to no purpose. The 2 suit of swan's plumage, which I and the young ones dragged over here from the land of the Nile, are of no use. Trouble enough it was to us to bring them here in 3 journeys, and now they are lying at the bottom of the nest. And if a fire should happen to break out, and the wooden house be burnt down, they would be destroyed. And our good nest would be destroyed too, said the Mama Stork. But you think less of that than of your plumage stuff and your Moor princess. Go and stay with her in the marsh if you like. You are a bad father to your own children, as I have told you already, when I hatched my first brood. I only hope neither we nor our children may have an arrow sent through our wings, owing to that wild girl. Helga does not know in the least what she is about. We have lived in this house longer than she has. She should think of that, and we have never forgotten our duty. We have paid every year our toll of a feather, an egg, and a young one, as it is only right we should do. You don't suppose I can wander about the courtyard, or go everywhere as I used to do in old times. I can do it in Egypt, where I can be a companion of the people, without forgetting myself. But here, I cannot go and peep into the pots and kettles as I do there. No, I can only sit up here and feel angry with that girl, the little wretch. And I am angry with you too. You should have left her lying in the water lily, then no one would have known anything about her. You are far better than your conversation, said the Papa Stork. I know you better than you know yourself. And with that, he gave a hop and flapped his wings twice, proudly. Then he stretched his neck and flew, or rather soared away, without moving his outspread wings. He went on for some distance, and then he gave a great flap with his wings, and flew on his course at a rapid rate, his head and neck bending proudly before him, while the sun's rays fell on his glossy plumage. He is the handsomest of them all, said the Mama Stork as she watched him. But I won't tell him so. Early in the autumn, the Viking again returned home, laden with spoil, and bringing prisoners with him. Among them was a young Christian priest, one of those who contemned the gods of the north. Often lately, there had been, both in hall and chamber, a talk of the new faith, which was spreading far and wide in the south, and which, through the means of the holy Ansgarius, had already reached as far as Hedeby on the Schlei. Even Helga had heard of this belief in the teachings of one who was named Christ, and who, for the love of mankind, and for their redemption, had given up his life. But to her, all this had, as it were, gone in one ear and out the other. It seemed that she only understood the meaning of the word love, when in the form of a miserable frog, she crouched together in the corner of the sleeping chamber. But the Viking's wife had listened to the wonderful story and had felt herself strangely moved by it. On their return, after this voyage, the men spoke of the beautiful temples built of polished stone, which had been raised for the public worship of this holy love. Some vessels, curiously formed of massive gold, had been brought home among the booty. There was a peculiar fragrance about them all, for they were incense vessels, which had been swung before the altars in the temples by the Christian priests. In the deep, stony cellars of the castle, the young Christian priest was immured, and his hands and feet tied together with strips of bark. The Viking's wife considered him as beautiful as Balder, and his distress raised her pity. But Helga said he ought to have ropes fastened to his heels and be tied to the tails of wild animals. I would let the dogs loose after him, she said. Over the moor and across the heath. Hurrah! That would be a spectacle for the gods, and better still to follow in its course. But the Viking would not allow him to die such a death as that, especially as he was the disowned and despiser of the high gods. In a few days, he had decided to have him offered as a sacrifice on the bloodstone in the grove. For the first time, a man was to be sacrificed here. Helga begged to be allowed to sprinkle the assembled people with the blood of the priest. She sharpened her glittering knife, and when one of the great, savage dogs, who were running about the Viking's castle in great numbers, sprang towards her, she thrust the knife into his side, merely, as she said, to prove its sharpness. The Viking's wife looked at the wild, badly disposed girl with great sorrow, and when night came on, and her daughter's beautiful form and disposition were changed, she spoke in eloquent words to Helga of the sorrow and deep grief that was in her heart. The ugly frog, in its monstrous shape, stood before her and raised its brown, mournful eyes to her face, listening to her words, and seeming to understand them with the intelligence of a human being. Never once to my lord and husband has a word passed my lips of what I have to suffer through you. My heart is full of grief about you, said the Viking's wife. The love of a mother is greater and more powerful than I ever imagined. But love never entered thy heart. It is cold and clammy, like the plants on the moor. Then the miserable form trembled. It was as if these words had touched an invisible bond between body and soul, for great tears stood in the eyes. A bitter time will come for thee at last, continued the Viking's wife, and it will be terrible for me too. It had been better for thee if thou hadst been left on the high road, with the cold night wind to lull thee to sleep. And the Viking's wife shed bitter tears and went away in anger and sorrow, passing under the partition of firs, which hung loose over the beam and divided the hall. The shriveled frog still sat in the corner alone. Deep silence reigned around. At intervals, a half-stifled sigh was heard from its inmost soul. It was the soul of Helga. It seemed in pain, as if a new life were arising in her heart. Then she took a step forward and listened, then stepped again forward and seized with her clumsy hands the heavy bar which was laid across the door. Gently, and with much trouble, she pushed back the bar, silently lifted the latch, and then took up the glimmering lamp which stood in the antechamber of the hall. It seemed as if a stronger will than her own gave her strength. She removed the iron bolt from the closed cellar door and slipped in to the prisoner. He was slumbering. She touched him with her cold, moist hand, and as he awoke and caught sight of the hideous form, he shuddered as if he beheld a wicked apparition. She drew her knife, cut through the bonds which confined his hands and feet, and beckoned to him to follow her. He uttered some holy names and made the sign of the cross, while the form remained motionless by his side. "Who art thou?" he asked. whose outward appearance is that of an animal, while thou willingly performest acts of mercy." And the horse galloped on more wildly than before. The sky painted itself red, the first sunbeam pierced through the clouds, and in the clear flood of sunlight, the frog became changed. It was Helga again, young and beautiful, but with a wicked, demoniac spirit. He held now a beautiful young woman in his arms, and he was horrified at the sight. He stopped the horse and sprang from its back. He imagined that some new sorcery was at work. But Helga also leaped from the horse and stood on the ground. The child's short garment reached only to her knee. She snatched the sharp knife from her girdle and rushed like lightning at the astonished priest. "Let me get at thee," she said. "Let me get at thee, that I may plunge this knife into thy body. Thou art pale as ashes, thou beardless slave." She pressed in upon him. They struggled with each other in heavy combat, but it was as if an invisible power had been given to the Christian in the struggle. He held her fast, and the old oak under which they stood seemed to help him, for the loosened roots on the ground became entangled in the maiden's feet and held them fast. Close by rose a bubbling spring, and he sprinkled Helga's face and neck with the water, commanded the unclean spirit to come forth, and pronounced upon her a Christian blessing. But the water of faith has no power unless the wellspring of faith flows within. And yet even here its power was shown. Something more than the mere strength of a man opposed itself, through his means, against the evil which struggled within her. His holy action seemed to overpower her. She dropped her arms, glanced at him with pale cheeks and looks of amazement. He appeared to her a mighty magician skilled in secret arts. His language was the darkest magic to her, and the movements of his hands in the air were as the secret signs of a magician's wand. She would not have blinked had he waved over her head a sharp knife or a glittering axe, but she shrunk from him as he signed her with the sign of the cross on her forehead and breast, and sat before him like a tame bird, with her head bowed down. Then he spoke to her, in gentle words, of the deed of love she had performed for him during the night, when she had come to him in the form of an ugly frog, to loosen his bonds, and to lead him forth to life and light. And he told her that she was bound in closer fetters than he had been, and that she could recover also life and light by his means. He would take her to Hedeby, to St. Ansgarius, and there, in that Christian town, the spell of the sorcerer would be removed. But he would not let her sit before him on the horse, though of her own free will she wished to do so. "Thou must sit behind me, not before me," said he. "Thy magic beauty has a magic power which comes from an evil origin, and I fear it. Still, I am sure to overcome through my faith in Christ." Then he knelt down and prayed with pious fervor. It was as if the quiet woodland were a holy church consecrated by his worship. The birds sang as if they were also of this new congregation, and the fragrance of the wild flowers was as the ambrosial perfume of incense, while, above all, sounded the words of Scripture, "A light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide their feet into the way of peace." And he spoke these words with the deep longing of his whole nature. Meanwhile, the horse that had carried them in wild career stood quietly by, plucking at the tall bramble bushes, till the ripe young berries fell down upon Helga's hands, as if inviting her to eat. Patiently, she allowed herself to be lifted on the horse, and sat there like a somnambulist, as one who walked in his sleep. The Christian bound 2 branches together with bark in the form of a cross and held it on high as they rode through the forest. The way gradually grew thicker of brushwood as they rode along, till at last it became a trackless wilderness. Bushes of the wild sloe here and there blocked up the path so that they had to ride over them. The bubbling spring formed not a stream, but a marsh, round which also they were obliged to guide the horse. Still, there were strength and refreshment in the cool forest breeze, and no trifling power in the gentle words spoken in faith and Christian love by the young priest, whose inmost heart yearned to lead this poor lost one into the way of light and life. It is said that raindrops can make a hollow in the hardest stone, and the waves of the sea can smooth and round the rough edges of the rocks. So did the dew of mercy fall upon Helga, softening what was hard and smoothing what was rough in her character. These effects did not yet appear. She was not herself aware of them. Neither does the seed in the lap of earth know, when the refreshing dew and the warm sunbeams fall upon it, that it contains within itself power by which it will flourish and bloom. The song of the mother sinks into the heart of the child, and the little one prattles the words after her without understanding their meaning. But after a time, the thoughts expand, and what has been heard in childhood seems to the mind clear and bright. So now, the Word, which is all-powerful to create, was working in the heart of Helga. They rode forth from the thick forest, crossed the heath, and again entered a pathless wood. Here, towards evening, they met with robbers. "Where hast thou stolen that beauteous maiden?" said the robbers, seizing the horse by the bridle and dragging the 2 riders from its back. The priest had nothing to defend himself with but the knife he had taken from Helga, and with this he struck out right and left. One of the robbers raised his axe against him, but the young priest sprang on one side and avoided the blow, which fell with great force on the horse's neck, so that the blood gushed forth, and the animal sunk to the ground. Then Helga seemed suddenly to awake from her long, deep reverie. She threw herself hastily upon the dying animal. The priest placed himself before her to defend and shelter her. But one of the robbers swung his iron axe against the Christian's head with such force that it was dashed to pieces. The blood and brains were scattered about, and he fell dead upon the ground. Then the robbers seized beautiful Helga by her white arms and slender waist. But at that moment, the sun went down, and as its last ray disappeared, she was changed into the form of a frog. A greenish-white mouth spread half over her face. Her arms became thin and slimy, while broad hands, with webbed fingers, spread themselves out like fans. Then the robbers, in terror, let her go, and she stood among them, a hideous monster. And as is the nature of frogs to do, she hopped up as high as her own size and disappeared in the thicket. Then the robbers knew that this must be the work of an evil spirit or some secret sorcery, and, in a terrible fright, they ran hastily from the spot. The full moon had already risen and was shining in all her radiant splendor over the earth, when from the thicket, in the form of a frog, crept poor Helga. She stood still by the corpse of the Christian priest and the carcass of the dead horse. She looked at them with eyes that seemed to weep, and from the frog's head came forth a croaking sound, as when a child bursts into tears. She threw herself first upon one, and then upon the other, brought water in her hand, which, from being webbed, was large and hollow, and poured it over them. But they were dead, and dead they would remain. She understood that, at last. Soon, wild animals would come and tear their dead bodies. But no, that must not happen. Then she dug up the earth, as deep as she was able, that she might prepare a grave for them. She had nothing but a branch of a tree, and her 2 hands, between the fingers of which the webbed skin stretched, and they were torn by the work, while the blood ran down her hands. She saw at last that her work would be useless, more than she could accomplish. So she fetched more water, and washed the face of the dead, and then covered it with fresh green leaves. She also brought large boughs, and spread over him, and scattered dried leaves between the branches. Then she brought the heaviest stones that she could carry, and laid them over the dead body, filling up the crevices with moss, till she thought she had fenced in his resting place strongly enough. The difficult task had employed her the whole night, and as the sun broke forth, there stood the beautiful Helga in all her loveliness, with her bleeding hands, and, for the first time, with tears on her maiden cheeks. It was, in this transformation, as if 2 natures were striving together within her. Her whole frame trembled, and she looked around her as if she had just awoke from a painful dream. She leaned for support against the trunk of a slender tree, and at last climbed to the topmost branches, like a cat, and seated herself firmly upon them. She remained there the whole day, sitting alone, like a frightened squirrel, in the silent solitude of the wood, where the rest and stillness is as the calm of death. Butterflies fluttered around her, and close by were several ant hills, each with its hundreds of busy little creatures moving quickly to and fro. In the air danced myriads of gnats, swarm upon swarm, troops of buzzing flies, ladybirds, dragonflies with golden wings, and other little winged creatures. The worm crawled forth from the moist ground, and the moles crept out. But, excepting these, all around had the stillness of death. But when people say this, they do not quite understand themselves what they mean. None noticed Helga, but a flock of magpies, which flew chattering round the top of the tree on which she sat. These birds hopped close to her on the branches with bold curiosity. A glance from her eyes was a signal to frighten them away, and they were not clever enough to find out who she was. Indeed, she hardly knew herself. When the sun was near setting, and the evening's twilight about to commence, the approaching transformation aroused her to fresh exertion. She let herself down gently from the tree, and, as the last sunbeam vanished, she stood again in the wrinkled form of a frog, with the torn, webbed skin on her hands. But her eyes now gleamed with more radiant beauty than they had ever possessed in her most beautiful form of loveliness. They were now pure, mild, maidenly eyes that shone forth in the face of a frog. They showed the existence of deep feeling and a human heart, and the beauteous eyes overflowed with tears, weeping precious drops that lightened the heart. On the raised mound which she had made as a grave for the dead priest, she found the cross made of the branches of a tree, the last work of him who now lay dead and cold beneath it. A sudden thought came to Helga, and she lifted up the cross and planted it upon the grave, between the stones that covered him and the dead horse. The sad recollection brought the tears to her eyes, and in this gentle spirit, she traced the same sign in the sand round the grave. And as she formed, with both her hands, the sign of the cross, the web skin fell from them like a torn glove. She washed her hands in the water of the spring and gazed with astonishment at their delicate whiteness. Again, she made the holy sign in the air between herself and the dead man. Her lips trembled, her tongue moved, and the name which she in her ride through the forest had so often heard spoken rose to her lips, and she uttered the words, Jesus Christ. Then the frog skin fell from her. She was once more a lovely maiden. Her head bent wearily, her tired limbs required rest, and then she slept. Her sleep, however, was short. Towards midnight, she awoke. Before her stood the dead horse, prancing and full of life, which shone forth from his eyes and from his wounded neck. Close by his side appeared the murdered Christian priest, more beautiful than Baldur, as the Viking's wife had said. But now he came as if in a flame of fire. Such gravity, such stern justice, such a piercing glance shone from his large, gentle eyes that it seemed to penetrate into every corner of her heart. Beautiful Helga trembled at the look, and her memory returned with a power as if it had been the day of judgment. Every good deed that had been done for her, every loving word that had been said, were vividly before her mind. She understood now that love had kept her here during the day of her trial. While the creature formed of dust and clay, soul and spirit, had wrestled and struggled with evil, she acknowledged that she had only followed the impulses of an evil disposition, that she had done nothing to cure herself. Everything had been given her, and all had happened, as it were, by the ordination of Providence. She bowed herself humbly, confessed her great imperfections in the sight of Him who can read every fault of the heart, and then the priest spoke. Daughter of the moorland, thou hast come from the swamp and the marshy earth, but from this thou shalt arise. The sunlight shining into thy inmost soul proves the origin from which thou hast really sprung, and has restored the body to its natural form. I am come to thee from the land of the dead, and thou also must pass through the valley to reach the holy mountains where mercy and perfection dwell. I cannot lead thee to Hidabi, that thou mayst receive Christian baptism. For first, thou must remove the thick veil with which the waters of the moorland are shrouded, and bring forth from its depths the living author of thy being and thy life. Till this is done, thou canst not receive consecration. Then he lifted her on the horse and gave her a golden censer, similar to those she had already seen at the Viking's house. A sweet perfume arose from it, while the open wound in the forehead of the slain priest shone with the rays of a diamond. He took the cross from the grave and held it aloft, and now they rode through the air, over the rustling trees, over the hills where warriors lay buried, each by his dead war horse. And the brazen monumental figures rose up and galloped forth, and stationed themselves on the summits of the hills. The golden crescent on their foreheads, fastened with golden knots, glittered in the moonlight, and their mantles floated in the wind. The dragon, that guards buried treasure, lifted his head and gazed after them. The goblins and the satyrs peeped out from beneath the hills and flitted to and fro in the fields, waving blue, red, and green torches, like the glowing sparks in burning paper. Over woodland and heath, flood and fen, they flew on, till they reached the wild moor, over which they hovered in broad circles. The Christian priest held the cross aloft, and it glittered like gold, while from his lips sounded pious prayers. Beautiful Helga's voice joined with his in the hymns he sung, as a child joins in her mother's song. She swung the censer, and a wonderful fragrance of incense arose from it, so powerful that the reeds and rushes of the moor burst forth into blossom. Each germ came forth from the deep ground. All that had life raised itself. Blooming water lilies spread themselves forth like a carpet of wrought flowers, and upon them lay a slumbering woman, young and beautiful. Helga fancied that it was her own image she saw reflected in the still water, but it was her mother she beheld, the wife of the Marsh king, the princess from the land of the Nile. The dead Christian priest desired that the sleeping woman should be lifted on the horse, but the horse sank beneath the load, as if he had been a funeral pall fluttering in the wind. But the sign of the cross made the airy phantom strong. And then the three rode away from the marsh to firm ground. At the same moment, the cock crew in the Viking's castle, and the dream figures dissolved and floated away in the air. But mother and daughter stood opposite to each other. "Am I looking at my own image in the deep water?" said the mother. "Is it myself that I see represented on a white shield?" said the daughter. Then they came nearer to each other in a fond embrace. The mother's heart beat quickly, and she understood the quickened pulses. "My child," she exclaimed, "the flower of my heart, my lotus flower of the deep water." And she embraced her child again and wept, and the tears were as a baptism of new life and love for Helga. "In swan's plumage I came here," said the mother, "and here I threw off my feather dress. Then I sank down through the wavering ground, deep into the marsh beneath, which closed like a wall around me. I found myself, after a while, in fresher water. Still, a power drew me down deeper and deeper. I felt the weight of sleep upon my eyelids. Then I slept, and dreams hovered round me. It seemed to me as if I were again in the pyramids of Egypt, and yet the waving elder trunk that had frightened me on the moor stood ever before me. I observed the clefts and wrinkles in the stem. They shone forth in strange colors and took the form of hieroglyphics. It was the mummy case on which I gazed. At last it burst, and forth stepped the 1,000-years-old king, the mummy form, black as pitch, black as the shining wood snail, or the slimy mud of the swamp. Whether it was really the mummy or the Marsh king, I know not. He seized me in his arms, and I felt as if I must die. When I recovered myself, I found in my bosom a little bird, flapping its wings, twittering and fluttering. The bird flew away from my bosom, upwards towards the dark, heavy canopy above me, but a long green band kept it fastened to me. I heard and understood the tenor of its longings. Freedom, sunlight, to my father. Then I thought of my father, and the sunny land of my birth, my life, and my love. Then I loosened the band and let the bird fly away to its home, to a father. Since that hour, I have ceased to dream. My sleep has been long and heavy, till in this very hour, harmony and fragrance awoke me and set me free. The green band which fastened the wings of the bird to the mother's heart, where did it flutter now? Whither had it been wafted? The stork only had seen it. The band was the green stalk, the cup of the flower, the cradle in which lay the child, that now, in blooming beauty, had been folded to the mother's heart. And while the two were resting in each other's arms, the old stork flew round and round them in narrowing circles, till at length he flew away swiftly to his nest, and fetched away the 2 suits of swan's feathers, which he had preserved there for many years. Then he returned to the mother and daughter, and threw the swan's plumage over them. The feathers immediately closed around them, and they rose up from the earth in the form of 2 white swans. "And now we can converse with pleasure," said the stork papa. "We can understand one another, although the beaks of birds are so different in shape. It is very fortunate that you came tonight. Tomorrow we should have been gone. The mother, myself, and the little ones were about to fly to the south. Look at me now. I am an old friend from the Nile, and a mother's heart contains more than her beak. She always said that the princess would know how to help herself. I and the young ones carried the swan's feathers over here, and I am glad of it now, and how lucky it is that I am here still. When the day dawns, we shall start with a great company of other storks. We'll fly first, and you can follow in our track so that you cannot miss your way. I and the young ones will have an eye upon you. And the lotus flower, which I was to take with me," said the Egyptian princess, "is flying here by my side, clothed in swan's feathers. The flower of my heart will travel with me, and so the riddle is solved. Now for home, now for home." But Helga said she could not leave the Danish land without once more seeing her foster mother, the loving wife of the Viking. Each pleasing recollection, each kind word, every tear from the heart which her foster mother had wept for her, rose in her mind, and at that moment she felt as if she loved this mother the best. "Yes, we must go to the Viking's castle," said the stork. "Mother and the young ones are waiting for me there. How they will open their eyes and flap their wings. My wife, you see, does not say much. She is short and abrupt in her manner, but she means well for all that. I will flap my wings at once, that they may hear us coming." Then Stork Papa flapped his wings in first-rate style, and he and the swans flew away to the Viking's castle. In the castle, everyone was in a deep sleep. It had been late in the evening before the Viking's wife retired to rest. She was anxious about Helga, who, 3 days before, had vanished with the Christian priest. Helga must have helped him in his flight, for it was her horse that was missed from the stable. But by what power had all this been accomplished? The Viking's wife thought of it with wonder, thought on the miracles which they said could be performed by those who believed in the Christian faith and followed its teachings. These passing thoughts formed themselves into a vivid dream, and it seemed to her that she was still lying awake on her couch, while without darkness reigned. A storm arose. She heard the lake dashing and rolling from east and west, like the waves of the North Sea or the Kattegat. The monstrous snake, which, it is said, surrounds the earth in the depths of the ocean, was trembling in spasmodic convulsions. The night of the fall of the gods was come, Ragnarok, as the heathens call the judgment day, when everything shall pass away, even the high gods themselves. The war trumpet sounded. Riding upon the rainbow came the gods, clad in steel, to fight their last battle on the last battlefield. Before them flew the winged vampires, and the dead warriors closed up the train. The whole firmament was ablaze with the northern lights, and yet the darkness triumphed. It was a terrible hour, and close to the terrified woman, Helga seemed to be seated on the floor, in the hideous form of a frog, yet trembling, and clinging to her foster mother, who took her on her lap and lovingly caressed her, hideous and frog-like as she was. The air was filled with the clashing of arms and the hissing of arrows. as if a storm of hail was descending upon the earth. It seemed to her the hour when earth and sky would burst asunder, and all things be swallowed up in Saturn's fiery lake. But she knew that a new heaven and a new earth would arise, and that cornfields would wave, where now the lake rolled over desolate sands, and the ineffable God reign. Then she saw rising from the region of the dead, Baldur the gentle, the loving. And as the Viking's wife gazed upon him, she recognized his countenance. It was the captive Christian priest. "White Christian," she exclaimed aloud, and with the words, she pressed a kiss on the forehead of the hideous frog child. Then the frog skin fell off, and Helga stood before her in all her beauty, more lovely and gentle-looking, and with eyes beaming with love. She kissed the hands of her foster mother, blessed her for all her fostering love and care during the days of her trial and misery, for the thoughts she had suggested and awoke in her heart, and for naming the name which she now repeated. Then beautiful Helga rose as a mighty swan and spread her wings with the rushing sound of troops of birds of passage flying through the air. Then the Viking's wife awoke, but she still heard the rushing sound without. She knew it was the time for the storks to depart, and that it must be their wings which she heard. She felt she should like to see them once more and bid them farewell. She rose from her couch, stepped out on the threshold, and beheld, on the ridge of the roof, a party of storks ranged side by side. Troops of the birds were flying in circles over the castle and the highest trees. But just before her, as she stood on the threshold and close to the well where Helga had so often sat and alarmed her with her wildness, now stood two swans, gazing at her with intelligent eyes. Then she remembered her dream, which still appeared to her as a reality. She thought of Helga in the form of a swan. She thought of a Christian priest, and suddenly a wonderful joy arose in her heart. The swans flapped their wings and arched their necks as if to offer her a greeting, and the Viking's wife spread out her arms towards them as if she accepted it and smiled through her tears. She was roused from deep thought by a rustling of wings and snapping of beaks. All the storks arose and started on their journey towards the south. "We will not wait for the swans," said the mama stork. "If they want to go with us, let them come now. We can't sit here till the plovers start. It is a fine thing, after all, to travel in families, not like the finches and the partridges. There, the male and the female birds fly in separate flocks, which, to speak candidly, I consider very unbecoming. What are those swans flapping their wings for?" "Well, everyone flies in his own fashion," said the papa stork. "The swans fly in an oblique line, the cranes in the form of a triangle, and the plovers in a curved line like a snake." "Don't talk about snakes while we are flying up here," said Stork Mama. "It puts ideas into the children's heads that cannot be realized." "Are those the high mountains I've heard spoken of?" asked Helga in the swan's plumage. "They are storm clouds driving along beneath us," replied her mother. "What are yonder white clouds that rise so high?" again inquired Helga. "Those are mountains covered with perpetual snows that you see yonder," said her mother. And then they flew across the Alps towards the blue Mediterranean. "Africa's land, Egyptia's strand," sang the daughter of the Nile in her swan's plumage, as from the upper air she caught sight of her native land, a narrow, golden, wavy strip on the shores of the Nile. The other birds espied it also and hastened their flight. "I can smell the Nile mud and the wet frogs," said the stork mama, "and I begin to feel quite hungry. Yes, now you shall taste something nice, and you will see the marabou bird, and the ibis, and the crane. They all belong to our family, but they are not nearly so handsome as we are. They give themselves great airs, especially the ibis. The Egyptians have spoiled him. They make a mummy of him and stuff him with spices. I would rather be stuffed with live frogs, and so would you, and so you shall. Better have something in your inside while you are alive than to be made a parade of after you are dead. That is my opinion, and I am always right." "The storks are come," was said in the great house on the banks of the Nile, where the Lord lay in the hall on his downy cushions, covered with a leopard skin, scarcely alive, yet not dead, waiting and hoping for the lotus flower from the deep moorland in the far north. Relatives and servants were standing by his couch when the two beautiful swans who had come with the storks flew into the hall. They threw off their soft white plumage, and two lovely female forms approached the pale, sick old man and threw back their long hair. And when Helga bent over her grandfather, redness came back to his cheeks. His eyes brightened, and life returned to his benumbed limbs. The old man rose up with health and energy renewed. Daughter and grandchild welcomed him as joyfully as if with a morning greeting after a long and troubled dream. Joy reigned through the whole house, as well as in the stork's nest, although there the chief cause was really the good food, especially the quantities of frogs, which seemed to spring out of the ground in swarms. Then the learned men hastened to note down, in flying characters, the story of the two princesses, and spoke of the arrival of the health-giving flower as a mighty event, which had been a blessing to the house and the land. Meanwhile, the stork papa told the story to his family in his own way, but not till they had eaten and were satisfied. Otherwise, they would have had something else to do than to listen to stories. "Well," said the stork mama when she had heard it, "you will be made something of at last. I suppose they can do nothing less." "What could I be made?" said stork papa. "What have I done? Just nothing." "You have done more than all the rest," she replied. "But for you and the youngsters, the two young princesses would never have seen Egypt again, and the recovery of the old man would not have been effected. You will become something. They must certainly give you a doctor's hood, and our young ones will inherit it, and their children after them, and so on. You already look like an Egyptian doctor, at least in my eyes." "I cannot quite remember the words I heard when I listened on the roof," said stork papa, while relating the story to his family. "All I know is that what the wise men said was so complicated and so learned that they received not only rank, but presents. Even the head cook at the great house was honored with a mark of distinction, most likely for the soup." "And what did you receive?" said the stork mama. "They certainly ought not to forget the most important person in the affair, as you really are. The learned men have done nothing at all but use their tongues. Surely they will not overlook you." Late in the night, while the gentle sleep of peace rested on the now happy house, there was still one watcher. It was not stork papa, who, although he stood on guard on one leg, could sleep soundly. Helga alone was awake. She leaned over the balcony, gazing at the sparkling stars that shone clearer and brighter in the pure air than they had done in the north. And yet, they were the same stars. She thought of the Viking's wife in the wild moorland, of the gentle eyes of her foster mother, and of the tears she had shed over the poor frog child that now lived in splendor and starry beauty by the waters of the Nile, with air balmy and sweet as spring. She thought of the love that dwelt in the breast of the heathen woman, love that had been shown to a wretched creature, hateful as a human being, and hideous when in the form of an animal. She looked at the glittering stars and thought of the radiance that had shone forth on the forehead of the dead man, as she had fled with him over the woodland and moor. Tones were awakened in her memory, words which she had heard him speak as they rode onward, when she was carried, wondering and trembling, through the air. Words from the great fountain of love, the highest love that embraces all the human race. What had not been won and achieved by this love? Day and night, beautiful Helga was absorbed in the contemplation of the great amount of her happiness, and lost herself in the contemplation, like a child who turns hurriedly from the giver to examine the beautiful gifts. She was overpowered with her good fortune, which seemed always increasing, and therefore, what might it become in the future? Had she not been brought by a wonderful miracle to all this joy and happiness? And in these thoughts she indulged, until at last she thought no more of the giver. It was the overabundance of youthful spirits unfolding its wings for a daring flight. Her eyes sparkled with energy, when suddenly arose a loud noise in the court below, and the daring thought vanished. She looked down and saw 2 large ostriches running round quickly in narrow circles. She had never seen these creatures before. Great, coarse, clumsy-looking birds with curious wings that looked as if they had been clipped, and the birds themselves had the appearance of having been roughly used. She inquired about them, and for the first time heard the legend which the Egyptians relate respecting the ostrich. Once, say they, the ostriches were a beautiful and glorious race of birds with large, strong wings. One evening, the other large birds of the forest said to the ostrich, "Brother, shall we fly to the river tomorrow morning to drink, God willing?" And the ostrich answered, "I will." With the break of day, therefore, they commenced their flight, first rising high in the air, towards the sun, which is the eye of God. Still higher and higher the ostrich flew, far above the other birds, proudly approaching the light, trusting in its own strength, and thinking not of the giver, or saying, "If God will." When suddenly the avenging angel drew back the veil from the flaming ocean of sunlight, and in a moment the wings of the proud bird were scorched and shriveled, and they sunk miserably to the earth. Since that time, the ostrich and his race have never been able to rise in the air. They can only fly terror-stricken along the ground, or run round and round in narrow circles. It is a warning to mankind that in all our thoughts and schemes, and in every action we undertake, we should say, "If God will." Then Helga bowed her head thoughtfully and seriously, and looked at the circling ostrich, as with timid fear and simple pleasure it glanced at its own great shadow on the sunlit walls. And the story of the ostrich sunk deeply into the heart and mind of Helga. A life of happiness, both in the present and in the future, seemed secure for her, and what was yet to come might be the best of all, God willing. Early in the spring, when the storks were again about to journey northward, beautiful Helga took off her golden bracelets, scratched her name on them, and beckoned to the stork father. He came to her, and she placed the golden circlet round his neck and begged him to deliver it safely to the Viking's wife, so that she might know that her foster daughter still lived, was happy, and had not forgotten her. It is rather heavy to carry, thought Stork Papa when he had it on his neck. But gold and honor are not to be flung into the street. The stork brings good fortune. They'll be obliged to acknowledge that, at last. You lay gold, and I lay eggs, said Stork Mama. With you, it is only once in a way. I lay eggs every year. But no one appreciates what we do. I call it very mortifying. But then, we have a consciousness of our own worth, Mother, replied Stork Papa. What good will that do you? Retorted Stork Mama. It will neither bring you a fair wind, nor a good meal. The little nightingale, who is singing yonder in the tamarind grove, will soon be going north, too. Helga said she had often heard her singing on the wild moor, so she determined to send a message by her. While flying in the swan's plumage, she had learnt the bird language. She had often conversed with the stork and the swallow, and she knew that the nightingale would understand. So she begged the nightingale to fly to the beechwood on the peninsula of Jutland, where a mound of stone and twigs had been raised to form the grave, and she begged the nightingale to persuade all the other little birds to build their nests round the place, so that evermore should resound over that grave music and song. And the nightingale flew away, and time flew away also. In the autumn, an eagle, standing upon a pyramid, saw a stately train of richly laden camels, and men attired in armor on foaming Arabian steeds, whose glossy skins shone like silver. Their nostrils were pink, and their thick, flowing manes hung almost to their slender legs. A royal prince of Arabia, handsome as a prince should be, and accompanied by distinguished guests, was on his way to the stately house, on the roof of which the stork's empty nests might be seen. They were away now in the far north, but expected to return very soon. And indeed, they returned on a day that was rich in joy and gladness. A marriage was being celebrated, in which the beautiful Helga, glittering in silk and jewels, was the bride, and the bridegroom, the young Arab prince. Bride and bridegroom sat at the upper end of the table, between the bride's mother and grandfather. But her gaze was not on the bridegroom, with his manly, sunburnt face, round which curled a black beard, and whose dark, fiery eyes were fixed upon her. But away from him, at a twinkling star that shone down upon her from the sky. Then was heard the sound of rushing wings beating the air. The storks were coming home, and the old stork pair, although tired with the journey and requiring rest, did not fail to fly down at once to the balustrades of the veranda, for they knew already what feast was being celebrated. They had heard of it on the borders of the land, and also that Helga had caused their figures to be represented on the walls, for they belonged to her history. I call that very sensible and pretty, said Stork Papa. Yes, but it is very little, said Mamma Stork. They could not possibly have done less. But when Helga saw them, she rose and went out into the veranda to stroke the backs of the storks. The old stork pair bowed their heads and curved their necks, and even the youngest among the young ones felt honored by this reception. Helga continued to gaze upon the glittering star, which seemed to glow brighter and purer in its light. Then between herself and the star floated a form purer than the air, and visible through it. It floated quite near to her, and she saw that it was the dead Christian priest, who also was coming to her wedding feast, coming from the heavenly kingdom. The glory and brightness yonder outshines all that is known on earth, said he. Then Helga the fair prayed more gently and more earnestly than she had ever prayed in her life before, that she might be permitted to gaze, if only for a single moment, at the glory and brightness of the heavenly kingdom. Then she felt herself lifted up, as it were, above the earth, through a sea of sound and thought. Not only around her, but within her, was there light and song, such as words cannot express. Now, we must return, he said. You will be missed. Only one more look, she begged, but one short moment more. We must return to earth. The guests will have all departed. Only one more look, the last. Then Helga stood again in the veranda. But the marriage lamps in the festive hall had been all extinguished, and the torches outside had vanished. The storks were gone. Not a guest could be seen. No bridegroom. All in those few short moments seemed to have died. Then a great dread fell upon her. She stepped from the veranda through the empty hall into the next chamber, where slept strange warriors. She opened a side door, which once led into her own apartment. But now, as she passed through, she found herself suddenly in a garden, which she had never before seen here. The sky blushed red. It was the dawn of morning. 3 minutes only in heaven, and a whole night on earth had passed away. Then she saw the storks, and called to them in their own language. Then Stork Papa turned his head towards here, listened to her words, and drew near. You speak our language, said he. What do you wish? Why do you appear, you, a strange woman? It is I. It is Helga. Dost thou not know me? 3 minutes ago, we were speaking together yonder in the veranda. That is a mistake, said the stork. You must have dreamed all this. No, no, she exclaimed. Then she reminded him of the Viking's castle, of the great lake, and of the journey across the ocean. Then Stork Papa winked his eyes and said, Why, that's an old story which happened in the time of my grandfather. There certainly was a princess of that kind here in Egypt once, who came from the Danish land, but she vanished on the evening of her wedding day, many 100 years ago, and never came back. You may read about it yourself yonder, on a monument in the garden. There you will find swans and storks sculptured, and on the top is a figure of the Princess Helga in marble. And so it was. Helga understood it all now and sank on her knees. The sun burst forth in all its glory, and, as in olden times, the form of the frog vanished in his beams, and the beautiful form stood forth in all its loveliness. So now, bathed in light, rose a beautiful form, purer, clearer than air, a ray of brightness from the source of light himself. The body crumbled into dust, and a faded lotus flower lay on the spot on which Helga had stood. Now that is a new ending to the story, said Stork Papa. I really never expected it would end in this way, but it seems a very good ending. And what will the young ones say to it, I wonder? Said Stork Mamma. Ah, that is a very important question, replied the stork. The end. Thank you for taking the time to listen along with me this evening. I hope this has helped to relax you and that you have enjoyed the story. If there are any stories you would like to hear in the future, please leave a comment in the section below, and please consider subscribing so that you won't miss out on all the stories coming to the channel very soon. And until next time, goodbye for now.